Okay, welcome, folks. We are continuing our tour through early modern philosophy. We've made our way through one of the classic texts, and really a focal point, not just for us, but for other early modern philosophers themselves. That focal text being Descartes in the Meditations on First Philosophy. In some ways, the remainder of early modern philosophy, all the way up to Kant, is in various ways trying to find ways of responding to the new approach that Descartes has laid down. One interesting thing about the study of early modern philosophy in recent decades is that more attention has been paid to some of the contributions made in the topic by women philosophers. And one of the women philosophers that often gets brought up in that conversation about women in early modern philosophy is this person right here, Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia. So she was indeed part of royalty and was able to dedicate a lot of her time to leisure and learning, and was able to think carefully about Descartes' meditations and was learning from some followers of Descartes. Interestingly, some of these followers of Descartes were not employed in philosophy departments, but rather in departments of medicine, where Descartes' approach to science was impressing them as well. In any case, what happens is Princess Elizabeth comes up with one of the most lasting objections to Descartes' mind-body dualism that we'll encounter in this course. So, here's what we're going to do today. I'm going to recap Descartes' meditations. I'm going to do it very quickly. And when we look back at the meditations, I'm going to re-emphasize one important detail. So with that re-emphasis on an important detail, we will understand that Princess Elizabeth isn't just saying, I don't like your arguments, or I don't like your conclusions, which is what a lot of people do in philosophy. They say like, well, Descartes says that the mind and body are two separate things. That just seems obviously wrong to me because of science, and you throw Descartes in the trash. Well, that's not what Princess Elizabeth did. In fact, in her objection to Descartes, she shows deep understanding of how to follow through on the implications of Cartesian thinking. But she is eventually going to present Descartes with an objection that is important. If it's not an objection, it might at least be a problem or a challenge for Descartes' theory. And when we start to think about the problem that Elizabeth leads us with, it does leave us with some questions about what theories make the most sense to us. So here is a very speedy recap of Descartes' meditations. First, Descartes lays out his foundationalism. That is, you should build everything you believe on certain foundations. And methodological skepticism. If you're going to know something, what you should do is doubt it as much as you can, and only believe when it's impossible not to believe. Right? Two, the first thing that Descartes finds that is impossible not to believe is about his own existence. Cogito ergo sum, that is, I think, therefore I am. And we will find, with this claim, that Descartes is certain of his own existence, and he realizes that because he's still uncertain of the existence of the material world, he thinks that gives us a first starting argument to believe that our minds are separate things from our bodies. We get some interesting moves in Meditations 3 through 5 as they relate to theology, right? So we get this fancy, complicated argument in Meditation 3 saying that our idea of God has maximal objective reality. That is, the idea of God is about something. It has a special object of thought, and the only explanation of that kind of thought is the object of thought itself, that is, God, the infinite substance. We get an argument from the innate idea of God in Meditation 5, right? And in between, we get what I call the problem of error. So how is it that a non-deceiving God allows you to make mistakes? Well, Descartes says that that's because you have a finite intellect, and you don't have a right to complain that God didn't make your intellect infinite. You know, you might think of every little bit of intellect that you got from God as a gift. And he also points out that your will is infinite. Either you have a will or you don't. That is, you have the power to do or not to do in a way that is not determined by external forces. And as such, if it's an on-off kind of thing, your will for Descartes is going to be infinite. Could not be less. So he's going to say that when you make errors, that's when you let your will, you make a decision to believe or assert something, you exercise your will before you have full understanding of something in your intellect. Right? The last move that we get in the meditation, so meditation 6, we bring it all together. Descartes gives us an argument that we know that not only do you exist, and not only does God exist, but also the material world around you also exists. And there, he's basing this on the idea that, look, we are representing the external world as an object in our thoughts, and we could not possibly correct that perception. That is, the perception of a material world is there when we are as carefully as possible thinking about a material world. And God's not a deceiver. We learn that in Meditations 3 through 5. And therefore, there must be a world around us as well. Now, Descartes does tell us that when we know that the material world exists, we should be thinking about the material world as an object of pure mathematics. So what the material world really is material stuff extended in space. He then gives us some final arguments claiming that the mind is distinct from the body. For instance, not only does he argue again that we can think about the mind and the body as separate existence, and now he says we can think about them as separate in a clear and distinct way. He also gives us the argument that the mind is completely indivisible, whereas material reality is always divisible. The mind and the body could not be the same thing because they have contrary properties and incompatible properties. So that's where we get with the meditations, right? We get an approach to epistemology, but also a way of thinking about the mind and matter, how it relates, and also fits God into the picture. Even if you disagree with Descartes' conclusions, we can note that it's a remarkable achievement in philosophy. Now, one of the questions that you might ask is, how do the mind and the body interact? Descartes makes some suggestions about this, even though it's not his main goal to explain how the mind and body interact. So, for instance, in Meditation 6 at page 123 in our edition, our Shapiro and Lascano edition, so at page 123 in this book, Descartes points out that hunger and pain are certain kinds of confused ways of thinking, right? When he's talking about a way of thinking being confused, he's talking about that way of thinking as not being distinct, right? It's not applying the right terms to things of the right categories. There's a bit of a jumble in there, right? It's sort of like talking about a tree is happy, right? That's sort of a confused way of thinking because trees, when we stop anthropomorphizing, we realize that trees aren't the kinds of things that can be happy. Well, Descartes is going to say that hunger and pain, etc., are confused ways of thinking. One way we might notice this is that the mind is not an extended thing, right? The mind is not a thing that takes up space. And hunger and pain are experiential, so in a very big way they're mental, but we also experience them as located in certain parts of our bodies. So we get this weird confusion, right? A mishmashing of categories when we say that a mental state is suffused throughout a certain place in our body, right? Now, Descartes says that we do have these confused ways of thinking as more or less a signaling system. He says, like, it's a good thing that when you injure your body, you feel it directly rather than indirectly feeling it. You infer, for instance, that the boat that you're on is damaged, but you directly experience that your own body has suffered, say, tissue damage. So what are we doing here? Well, Descartes is going to say, well, when you have these experiences of hunger and pain, they are sort of a mishmash of different categories. They're confused in a certain way, but we have these experiences so that we can have our minds and bodies in union, right? By having experiences of pain and hunger, that can send a signal to your mind that can remind you to enact certain behaviors that will keep your body and your mind healthy together. The broader picture we get from Descartes is that the mind and the body interact through the activity in the pineal gland. This is a gland in the middle of your brain, whereas the rest of your brain is like two symmetrical lobes. The pineal gland is a unitary little nub right in the middle. Descartes thought, this is where like all your sense organs unite. On page 126, he refers to it as the common sense. In his other writings, he talks more specifically about the pineal gland and why he thinks that it's the seat of the mind or the soul or consciousness. Right? And what happens is your mind has certain activities and it sends out little animal spirits, that is like little chemical or signals, little juices out to the body, which sends off certain physical reactions. And then the other way, your body could send certain physical events, animal spirits, they get to the pineal gland, and that sends a message back to the mind. Now again, remember, mind and body are completely different things. And when we bridge the mind and the body with certain kinds of sensations and experiences, Descartes says these are going to be inherently confused ways of thinking. But Descartes does seem to think that mind-body interaction is quite a real thing. So we'll notice that on this picture we have the mental realm over here that I've got in this gold color, and we've got the physical realm, these things that I've flagged here in the blue box. So, we realize that sometimes mental events cause physical things to happen. So for instance, I can decide to raise my arm. We're going to say that's a mental event, deciding to raise the arm, and then that can enact a physical event, the raising of my arm, right? So that's a mental event giving rise to a physical event. We should also notice that physical events can give rise to mental events. So let's say you're walking around and you experience, and there are lilac flowers blooming in the garden, and you're walking by and those little bits of scent get up into your nose and hit your smell receptors. So that could be like the lilac flowers blooming in the garden hitting your smell receptors. That would be a physical event as well. But on the Descartes picture, eventually those smell receptors are going to get to the pineal gland, and we could give a more scientifically accurate explanation of what the physical events are. But eventually we're going to jump the divide, and chemicals hitting your nose will turn into a mental event. The experiencing of the smell of lilacs, right? And in this picture I'm imagining that maybe you associate the experience of lilacs with your grandma's house. So you think about your grandma. Oh, that's a pretty interesting event where, here we have not only mental events causing physical events and physical events causing mental events, but we can also have mental events causing other mental events, right? So for instance, that experience of the smell could make you remember something, and that memory might make you feel nostalgic. You might miss your grandma if she's no longer with you, and that might make you feel sad. And when you have this sadness, that might actually be another example of a mental event causing a physical event. The crying causing, or the sadness causing crying. We might also notice that sometimes the crying might reflexively, you don't even have to feel anything in particular or decide to do anything. Sometimes like certain bodily events will lead to other ones. So the crying will physically lead to sniffling. Right. So on this picture, we have minds causing bodies to do things, bodies causing minds to do things, bodies causing bodies to do things, and minds causing other mental events within that same mind. So that is a picture that Descartes is assuming is working here, right? So we're just granting, based on experience, that mental events can cause physical events and vice versa. Now, here's a key move for Descartes. This comes early in the Meditations. So on page 101 of our edition, he says, "Were I perhaps tempted to describe this nature such as I conceived it in my mind, I would have described it as thus by body." So here, when he's talking about body, he's talking about the nature of material things, and he says, look, when I talk about body, I understand that it's capable of being bounded by a shape, of being enclosed in a place, of filling up space in such a way as to exclude other body from it, right? So I'm holding up this die here, and when I hold up this die, it is in a place, it takes up some space, and when I move it into this location, it pushes air out of the space where it was. So it is actually excluding other body from it, from the space that it's in. We also say, like, look, this die can be perceived by touch, sight, hearing, and I guess we could taste it or smell it. I'm not going to do that. We also say of being moved in several ways, not, of course, by itself, but whatever else impinges upon it. So we get a couple of points here. Often, when we talk about Descartes on the nature of body, this is key, right? The idea that the essence of body is extension. Bodies are just the kinds of things that take up space, and anything that takes up space is a body. We also notice that bodies are sense perceptible. Notice that Descartes doesn't say that about other things. So you might have experience of your own mind, and in a very direct way, but notice that you don't experience other people's minds directly. And moreover, what you're doing when you experience the minds of others is you infer the existence of the mind. You don't directly experience it. You cannot touch another person's mind, right? You cannot see a mind, or hear a mind, or taste a mind, or smell a mind, right? Now maybe you can hear somebody talking and infer that there is an individual with a mind behind those words, but the talking is a physical thing, right? That's sound waves. You don't hear a mind directly for Descartes. So this is this point, sense perceptible. But here's the last thing that Descartes points out, is that bodies, unlike minds, bodies are capable of being moved, but are not capable of moving themselves. Something else has to impinge on a body in order to move it. So for instance, I'm going to use my fists and represent them as billiard balls. So this is the 8-ball right here, and this is the white cue ball. Well, as long as nothing is impinging upon the 8-ball, it's going to stay stationary. You might think that that's like laws of inertia. Then we say, how do we get it to move? Well, we need something else to impinge on it, right? So the cue ball hits the 8-ball and it moves, right? Now, the contrast here, we'll also notice, is that minds are moved by themselves. So, for instance, by doing some philosophy, you are actually seeing the mind in the process of self-movement. Now, this is really important for Descartes. He's going to say, look, mind and body are utterly different kinds of things. And when we think about body, we are thinking about stuff taking up space, which is basically inert. It does not have powers of its own. And this is key because Descartes, in his broader project, is fighting against the Aristotelian picture of science. Because Aristotelians, for instance, think that, well, Earth is a basic fundamental part of reality, and it has power in itself to move downward. Or that it has power, not just to move downward, in its like material, right? It has like these internal properties, but it also has like a telos, so it's aiming to move downward, right? Descartes does not take this prime matter Aristotelian view. He's going to take this view that, well, every material thing is made up of the same kind of stuff. Descartes and his contemporaries, people like Locke and Galileo, thought that stuff is made up of this inert matter called corpuscles, right? And this stuff is basic matter which does not have principles of self-motion in it. Now, this is where Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia enters the chat. Because Princess Elizabeth has been learning and studying Descartes. And she has really learned from Descartes to move away from the Aristotelian picture of science. So she has tried the best that she can to learn Descartes' lesson that all material causation is efficient causation. That's like one event leading to another, to another, to another. And we also notice that physical events are events between inert matter, that's matter in motion and contact with one another. So when the one billiard ball hits the other and the other moves away, that's an example of what we're going to call efficient causation. So Descartes says, when we do physics, we should get rid of the other three Aristotelian causes. So we shouldn't do physics by thinking in terms of material causes, formal causes, or final causes. We should only be thinking about efficient causes. So now here we get Elizabeth's question. Elizabeth asks, please tell me, Mr. Descartes, how the soul of a human being, it being only a thinking substance, can determine the bodily spirits in order to bring about voluntary actions. For it seems that all determination of movement happens through the impulsion of the thing moved, by the matter in which it was pushed, by that which moves it, or else the particular qualities and shape of the surface of the latter. Physical contact is required for the first, and extension for the third. You entirely exclude the one, that is physical contact, from the notion you have a soul, and the other, that is extension, is incompatible with an immaterial thing. So Descartes is telling us that the immaterial soul is moving our body. Like somehow my immaterial soul, my decision to raise my arm in my head, is able to bring out some motion in the animal spirits, which then sets off a chain reaction and which makes me raise my arm. So it seems that if we accept Cartesian physics, as Elizabeth is assuming is true, she says the strange implication here is that immaterial minds cannot cause bodies to move, because on Cartesian physics, which is entirely in the realm of efficient causation, like billiard balls knocking into each other, we need either physical contact or we need extension. Think about these explanations of physical contact. We might say that a wet slope has things slide down it. Let's say like a garbage can might slide down a wet slope when it becomes rainy, right? And we might say that, that's because of certain textures of different things, but we need like physical contact. And that's easy to think about when we're thinking about, say, a sidewalk and a garbage can, because those are two physical things, right? The other thing that we talk about is manners of pushing. Of course, you need a physical thing to be pushing in a certain way on another thing. And physical contact. An immaterial thing cannot be in physical contact with another thing. So, this die that I'm holding here in my hand, an immaterial thing, the concept of the number 3, how can that be touching a physical thing? The concept of the number 3 can't touch anything. So Elizabeth has identified a problem here, right? She's pointed out that there are certain things that can cause material things to move, but they have to have a certain nature. And it seems that Descartes' theory has excluded the mind from having the kind of nature that something would need to move a thing. Because the ways that things move other things is going to be through contact, like pushing, impulsion, right? Or shape. So, we might think about how certain things will slide down slopes more easily depending on the shape of the surface, whether it's rough or smooth. But a mind is just not the kind of thing that has a shape. Its essence is not extension. For Descartes, the essence of a mind is thinking. Now, Descartes gets this letter, and at first he, talks about how he is so grateful to have this letter from Princess Elizabeth, and that he will cherish it. But he says, I'm going to try to answer you. So, one thing that he's going to suggest is that we don't want to think about the soul as a thing in the same way that we think about other things that cause movements. So it's very easy to think about a billiard ball and a cue ball as like two things, and the one thing causes the other thing to move. Right? Descartes says we can get messed up when we start trying to think about the soul in that way. He gives an analogy. He says, the weight of a body causes it to move. So he is going to make the claim that, when I let go of this die and drop it into my other hand, we might say that's because it has some weight. And because it has some weight, it's able to cause that falling to happen. Now, Descartes is then going to say, we shouldn't think about an object and its explanation of its falling being its weight, but to think of the weight as yet another thing that is pushing the object down in the way that like a billiard ball knocks into another billiard ball. So he's going to say that, part of the mistake that we can make is to think about the soul as another kind of material thing. It's not a material thing. Descartes also makes the suggestion that we have a confused understanding of a human being, I suppose, when we think about them as a union of two separate kinds of things, body and soul. And he says we tend to think about a body-soul union as a physical thing, and this can lead us into confused thinking and error. So Elizabeth replies to this. She says, there's something helpful to this analogy. So we don't want to think about the soul as yet another quasi-material thing. But she still wants to know more about the nature of the soul. What is it to be a soul? She says, she still wonders how anything that isn't material could move a material thing. If you tell me that the soul is immaterial, you're just telling me that it's not a thing that exists. It's simply not being material. It's a thing that exists outside the material realm. But how can what a thing isn't be the cause of something? She finds this distressing and to a certain sense like a non-explanation. And so she still wants to know more from Descartes about how we can explain how your immaterial soul can bring about a change in your material body, or vice versa, how your material body could bring about a change in your soul. Okay, now here's how Descartes is going to come back. He's going to say that we do have two things going on in us, right? We have material events in our bodies. Our stomachs are working, our sensory organs are being triggered by certain things. We should not confuse material events associated with thoughts themselves. So for instance, we could notice that when your brain gets scanned, it's going to trigger certain activities that could be picked up on an MRI. But certain kinds of blood flow or brain activities, those are material events associated with thoughts. They're not thoughts themselves. He further points out that he thinks he's given a proof that the mind and body are separate things. So you might think back to how we argued that the mind is never divisible. Material things are always divisible. A thing can't be both divisible and not divisible. So the mind and the body can't be the same thing. So he thinks that he's got logical arguments to rule out the unity of the mind and the body. So they are separate things with different essences. So he says, look, we should be sure that they're distinct. And on this basis, we can be sure that minds are immaterial. And we also, just by living, come to notice that thoughts can bring about material changes. I'll decide to raise my arm yet again, and there it goes. Now, he says, when we think about the mind-body union, we do think about these two things as a single thing, although we do get this confusion, right? It's not a clear and distinct thought when we think about our mind and body as one thing. He says part of the reason why this happens is that instead of using pure understanding, oftentimes we use our imagination. In Meditation 6, we learned that the idea of using your imagination instead of your understanding is relying on a certain mental picture instead of thinking in terms of true concepts and necessary connections about what a thing has to be in its essence. Now, at this point in the exchange, so we've got letters going back and forth between Descartes and Elizabeth. Elizabeth tells us, I admit that it would be easier for me to concede matter and extension to the soul than to concede the capacity to move the body and be moved by it to an immaterial thing. So if we go way back in this discussion, well, maybe we should just think about mental events as a certain kind of fancy physical event. And then we can see how, it's a certain kind of physical event, the decision causing another physical event, or, the experience of lilac smell is just yet another physical event in the chain of physical events that started it off. It can lead to some more internal mental but physical events, which will then cause more physical events beyond your body. That is like tears falling. So on this picture, it seems like Princess Christina is another princess that Descartes interacted with. That's another story. Princess Elizabeth seems to be saying, look, maybe we need to go back to square one. Maybe we should think about the relationship between mind and body as the relationship between two things with fundamentally the same kind of essence. That we can more easily explain the interaction between the mind and the body by thinking about mental events as a certain kind of fancy physical event. So maybe we would have a more elegant interaction explanation by treating thoughts as physical. Now, we'll conclude by noting this. This is embarrassing for Descartes, because it does seem to be that on his own theory, it should be really hard to explain the mind-body interaction. But we should notice here that simply because we have a challenge for Descartes, we have not yet proved him wrong. And Descartes does seem to have some interesting and hard-to-answer arguments that say that the mind and body are the same thing. But we should notice that even though he hasn't been proved wrong, it now leaves Descartes with an explanatory burden, right? So we might say that Descartes now has some explaining to do, explaining how mind and body interact if they're completely different kinds of things. And it seems like bodies need other bodies to change the way that they are. So I'll leave it to you, right? One way that we might go is abandon Descartes' mind-body-substance dualism. So in this way, we might say, we might say that one way to deal with this challenge is to give up the arguments in the meditations that say that the mind and body are utterly distinct. This would basically be to say, like, look, maybe we shouldn't be so sure that those arguments in the meditations worked. Another way to go would be to give up on Cartesian physics. We might say that causal interactions are a bit more complicated than one packet of corpuscles bumping into another packet of corpuscles. And that we need a much more expanded notion of how one thing can cause another thing. Now, Descartes did not yet know, for instance, about the theory of gravitation, where, for instance, we don't need contact or contact or impulsion between the two things. That is, like, there is a physical interaction between the sun and the earth, even though they're not touching through gravitation. But still, the theory of gravitation would complicate things, but it is still a theory about how two physical things interact, right? Now, if we can find cases where non-physical things, where immaterial things are a true explanation of physical events, that might help Descartes a bit. But at this point, Descartes is left with something that's very difficult to explain. Now, Descartes did not ultimately give up on his theory entirely. Part of what he did was he wrote a book about certain in-between perceptions, perceptions that aren't fully bodily and which aren't fully mental. And he referred to some of these perceptions as passions, right? So Descartes eventually wrote a book called The Passions of the Soul. He was trying to think about how emotion and certain physical feelings in the body can work as intermediaries between body and soul. So I will leave it to you to reflect on whether Princess Elizabeth's challenge can be answered, or perhaps whether it should cause us to abandon Cartesian dualism between the mind and the body. So thanks for listening, and as always, if you need anything from me, if you have any questions, please be in touch.